I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and that their land was never ceded. And I'm descended from people who came to this country very early, and who went to Vandemonians land as willing settlers. And I've got the great history of having 4 police magistrates in my family tree, no convicts. So on that rather depressing note, what I want to talk to you today is about the book I've done, which is about this big dark secret that not only happens in Victoria, but also South Australia. Lots of former convicts went to South Australia, and certainly plenty claimed that they'd come to Australia via South Australia on their death certificates to conceal the fact that they'd come here as convicts. So if I may share my screen. This has been a repressed history in Victoria, which is, so therefore I'm telling something which people didn't want to discuss. And what's been fascinating is that although we had found a lot of descendants of convicts since the book came out, so many more people have come forward and started to talk about their convict ancestors. But why do such a study? I mean, the convicts are a population of unfortunate people, most of them actually very vulnerable people, who found themselves exiled to a new colony a very long way away. But it was a population that was recorded in greater detail than any other in the world in the 19th century. But who were they really? Why did they end up in this plight? What were the deeper drivers of their offending and their subsequent punishment? What happened to them under sentence? How much did they or did they not suffer? Is it all a story of Gothic horror, or is it a lot more complicated? And then what happened to them in their lives after sentence? So perhaps we can't really understand convicts until we look at the whole extent of their life from birth to death. So how important were they in the making of colonial Australia? What can their story tell us about the role of the state, of social control and the duty of care of the state? And was it all an unmitigated Gothic horror? So what the study we've done is to create an historical frame, particularly for family history work, because when you're doing convict studies like this, it's so easy to pick up on the story, which has got lots and lots of data and lots of material, but that may not be a particularly representative story. And unfortunately, most people find who are descendants of convicts that their convicts have got a depressingly empty record in the convict archives, which is because they behaved themselves, and that's the major reason that they survived and raised a family. So how did we do this study? And it had 3 major partners. It was the Founders and Survivors Project, which began through the University of Tasmania in Melbourne, and then there's the Female Convict Research Centre, which is in Hobart. And if you do want to know about women convicts, please go there first. They have now researched every woman who was transported to Tasmania. It's an extraordinary piece of work. And then finally, the University of Melbourne supported this part of the project I'm going to talk about, which is what we call the Ships Project, which was a subsidiary of Founders and Survivors. And we researched 126 ships and 60 volunteer genealogists, some of them even overseas, worked online and researched the life courses of the convicts on the board of each of those ships. That produced a sample of just over 24,000 out of around 68,000 for whom there are usable records. So it was a very, very big sample. And we did this in partnership with the Female Convicts Research Centre via Janet McCalman in Hobart. What the volunteers did, we gave them training and lots of instructions, and they coded the convicts' time under sentence, counted the number of offences, what they were, whether it was drunkenness or running away or stripes of the lash or days in solitary. And then they were to trace a convict, if they could, to a recorded death, find any children they had, and if possible, whether they had descendants who served in the AIF. Now that's in a sense that there are two great data sets that span each other, that frame this whole period, which starts with the convicts and ends with the men going to the First World War. And there's a lot of similarities in that they are both populations who are pulled together by an historical circumstance and pushed through a system together. And it's a stress regime, whether it's going to war or whether it's being a convict. So how do they fare? Does it affect how long they live? Does it affect the way that they run their lives after they come out? Are they more or less likely to get married and have children, and so on? So we traced the convicts to recorded death, found their children, their AIF descendants, and of course any other historical mentions, mostly now, of course, via that wonderful thing we have in this country, Trove. And the result is a database of around 24,000 biographies that make up a group biography, what we can call a prosopography. So we're now able to look at the convict experience by pulling together around 24,000 individual lives. Now, to give you a sense of, the convict records give you a very small window into a life. And the green bit in this graph, which represents all the convicts in our sample, from birth on this side in red to their death at this side, you can see that the green bit, when they're under the gaze of what we call the paper panopticon, this record system that saw everything and recorded everything, that it's actually quite a small part of their lives. Of course, there were people who continued to offend after they left the convict system, but overwhelmingly those who did, they're not committing real big crimes. They're committing much more of behavioural offences such as drunkenness and bad language and vagrancy and prostitution. And when you can see that they cover, these lives in our database cover a huge slice of historical time. The oldest are born in the early 1750s. The last to die died after 1930. So this is a huge period of historical time, which covers the whole period of industrialization, the explosion of the world's population, starting in the United Kingdom, and the transformation of the rich world's work into an industrial system. So let's think about crime. And if we're going to think about crime, you've got to also think about it not just as doing bad things, but it's also a way of earning a living. People are doing it to make money, to get by, to get something to live. And this is all happening, that this period that our convicts are coming from, and the period where most of them were children and young people, was a period of great economic and social dislocation. And the real poverty was amongst those who had no property, the landless. And that means huge number of people in cities, but also increasing a very large number of people in the countryside who are being deprived of their traditional entitlements to the use of the commons. So they were no longer able to have their own animals. They could no longer grow small crops. They were also not able to glean and get work and to glean the remains of a crop, and a big drop in work for women. And so the peasantry went from having a contract which lasted a whole year to being paid by the day as day labour, and they've got nothing else to fall back on. Neither can they hunt because of the poaching laws. So the ways that people traditionally fed themselves have been taken away, and so they don't have property, they've lost their entitlements, and most of them didn't have saleable skills. They didn't have the sorts of things that they could go anywhere and earn a living from, like a stonemason could, but if you were an agricultural labourer, not. Now, what they particularly had lost by the fact that they were criminals and being convicted was a character. And that was your reference. That was the way in which people decided whether you were someone to be trusted, to be employed, and they'd also lost their social networks. Now, these were absolutely crucial to being able to survive. What you've got, therefore, is people living on the margin, and they lived in what's been called an economy of makeshifts. That's an informal or casual, or if you like, almost gig economy of petty theft, of a bit of major theft, but depending on begging, pilfering from workplaces, which was very common. It's still common, but it was considered a right for you to take things from your boss, particularly giving personal street services like carrying goods or sweeping a pathway. And what it meant is that you got people who went to cities where there were rich people, because rich people were a resource like coal. Rich people need service. Rich people have stuff you can steal. Rich people leave things about and have rubbish which has got value. And so they learn to live off people who've got more money, as though it was coal or forest or something. And this term, the economy of makeshifts, comes from an historian called Mr. Ager. The other thing, in a world made for men, I mean, there were boys who sold sex, but mostly it's women. The only other thing that people had to get by was to sell their bodies. And that women who had no male breadwinner or protector, either as a husband, a brother, a father, or they were members of a household as a servant and without a character, were left with nothing but their own bodies to sell. But though often this was a cover for thefts from the person, this was known as bilking, where they got a man drunk and stripped him of all his valuables while he was insensible. And they would hope to do that before they had to have sex with him. In the rural world, they were stealing food and animals because that's what was available, that's what had value, that's what they could sell on. And so there's really a very porous boundary between survival techniques and crime. It's not as though it's a black and white world at all, that lots of people were from day to day doing things which weren't quite legal. And then they get caught, or they mightn't get caught. So it's not as though there are good people and bad people. There are struggling people, and you've got this porous boundary between survival and crime. One of the things we found, because in the Tasmanian records, which I'm sorry to have to tell you in New South Wales, are very much better than the New South Wales records, in the indent, which was the record taken of the cargo of the ship, if you like, when they landed, they asked them various questions about the crime they'd committed. So did they admit to it? How did they describe it themselves? But then they asked them about their families. Who were their family? What had they left behind? And so what this means is that we've got a record of the family that they had left behind them. Now, what we were surprised to find is what made them different from their peers, from other people of their class at that time, was that they were far more likely to have lost their parents. So this was a brilliant piece of demography done by my colleague Rebecca Kippen, where she was able to work out what here would be the likelihood of orphanhood in the population, which in England and Wales, it was about it was only about 6%. In Surrey, which is rural England, was lower. Liverpool as a port, much, much bigger. London, bigger, but not as much as Liverpool. Ireland, many more likely to be, because, and that's the famine mortality there, showing you the terrible effect of the famine. And Glasgow was pretty bad. Now, Glasgow and Liverpool are bad places because for places a lot of loss of parents, because they're places where people would migrate because they're trying to find work and support. But this is the convicts, and what we can see is that they're far more likely to have lost their parents, and that women were much more vulnerable than men, and that the Irish were the most vulnerable of all, and those who were to be found in port cities were the most likely to have lost parents. So what you see here is these are a group of people who have grown up without the protection of a father, or without a mother, but mostly a father that could provide an income and fatherly care. So this is where they are different from their peers, and this is why they are so vulnerable. Now, the other measure, the great measure in human demography of how much stresses in your life affect you is when you die and what age you die. And here we've got here the ages of death of Tasmanian men and women generally, then that included the convicts. But you see that convict men had a much shorter lifespan than all Tasmanian men, and convict women shorter again. Now, around the world today, hardly any places in the world have women having a shorter lifespan than men. Where they have that, it's an indicator that women's status is diabolically bad. So that, for instance, Afghanistan, until quite recently, despite the high death rate of males in conflict, women had a lower life expectancy, often through not only just violence, but particularly through terrible things happening to them in childbirth. So a society where women are doing worse than men is a society that is really bad for women, and a society with extreme inequality. But the women who are described as being on the town, that is about 40% of the female convicts in their record, it said they'd been on the town for 1 year, 4 years, 7 years. On the town is actually about being a public woman, like a public house. Now, it doesn't exactly mean being a prostitute. They were nearly all prostitutes, or living by prostitution, or doing it occasionally, but they're women without a household. There were plenty of other women selling sex who were not on the town. They were private operators, operating from brothels where they were dressed by the madam and sent out. They might have been being kept by a man with means. They might have had their own property and been working from that. So there's a whole lot of other prostitutes who are not on the town. They're not public women. So what we're seeing here is the extreme vulnerability, effectively, of homeless women who are picking up a place to sleep from night to night by picking up a man and then taking him somewhere and getting him drunk. And the women who are not on the town do as well as the men. So we can see that this group is the one that's causing all the trouble in reducing women's life expectancy. And if you compare to non-convict Tasmanian women, female convicts were 3 times as likely to be murdered, twice as likely to commit suicide, 50% more likely to die of accidental causes. So that's those compared to those. Compared to other convict women, on the town convicts were 1/3 more likely to be murdered again, 4 times as likely to commit suicide, and 2/3 more likely to have alcohol implicated in the cause of death. So what you're seeing now is a disaster story about rough women who are prostitutes, who are drinkers, who are subject to a great deal of personal violence, and that these are the ones who are the most vulnerable and have the most drastic lives. So that's the wages of sin. So another thing that demographers do is to look at the year's life lost by risk factors, which today might be alcohol, or it might be what sort of work you do, or it might be a type of disease or a disability. And if we do the same sort of thing here, we see that the Irish compared to English were amongst men. They had almost 2 years less life span. The industrial urban compared to village-born men, even more than that. If they came from a port city like Liverpool, they were compared to village-born, they were 2.5 years less life And if they had more than 10 alcohol-related offences in their record, that really took a lot of years off their life, but nothing took years off their life more than having more than 90 days solitary confinement. And we found that being flogged did not shorten their lives, but solitary confinement did for both men and women in proportion to how much they had. So suddenly it turned out that although the flogging seems and was so cruel and painful and traumatic, it was nothing compared to the effect of solitary confinement. So that's really what did people in. If we look at women, if they're on the town, they are nearly 3 years just life expectancy. But if they were big drinkers, we get a massive, more than 7 years less. And if they had lots of conduct offences, which is probably about a third of them in the convict system, they're the really difficult, ruly and disturbed women. And the behaviour they display is what you see in people who've suffered sexual abuse as children. That they were hypervigilant, that they were terribly paranoid, that they were very quick to defend themselves. They had experienced helplessness, so they were fighting the world ever after. Many of them were actually broken by the system, but what you see is that desperate struggle of a once helpless child to fight off danger. Now, this is important for those of you with convict ancestries, because when we looked at their fertility, which is the other big measure we used in this study, we see that what was important about convict women, that where they came from and what their record was, that this affected how many children they had. And what is remarkable is that those who'd been on the town in England or in the town on Ireland had a very high rate of what we call acquired infertility. More than 30% of the on-the-town convict women had no children at all, and we're getting down to many of them having very few, and very few having a large family. We get the same thing with the Irish, and those who hadn't been on the town, they have lots of kids. There's a group who and they're the ones that we're all descended from. They're the ones who they tended to have big families, and they had daughters who had big families. So one of the important things about being descended from a convict is that very large number of people are descended from the same convicts. And that the ability of a human population with unrestricted fertility to reproduce itself exponentially, you see in these groups of who were very, very fertile. And they're the super breeders, and it's from them that most populations in the past have grown. And that's why if people look alike in a region, it's because they're actually all related. They may not know they're related, but they're related for going further back. And so what we have here is this phenomenon. But what's important is this acquired infertility, which comes principally from sexually transmitted infections, which are blocking the fallopian tubes or causing most pregnancies to fail. Now, I just want to show you a contrast, which is a work we did on the Aboriginal population in Victoria, which we were able to reconstruct almost completely because Victoria, first of all, destroyed the Aboriginal people far more completely and comprehensively than happened in New South Wales or Queensland. So they went from what we think was around 60,000 people in 1788 to just 600 by 1900. So it's as catastrophic as Tasmania, but it's all been covered up. That's another big secret about Victoria. There are today no Victorian Aboriginal people full blood left. Though there's around 30,000 identifying in the census, and that's going up every census, the last full Aboriginal person died about 30 years ago. So it's a story of genocide equivalent to what happened in Tasmania, and happened when you look at the maps of how Victoria developed after the gold rush, the roads, the towns, the railways, the telegraphs, you've got all the power of industrial society and a powerful empire absolutely conquering a landscape. And settling it in extraordinarily rapid time is probably the most rapid colonisation in the 19th century and the most complete one anywhere in the world. So, but the Aboriginal population, we've got the same thing, a very high number who had no children at all. And then it goes on, and then a small group who have a lot. And it's from this that the Aboriginal families who are dominant in Victoria have survived. But this is what was happening to fertility in the rest of the population. And what we see here is what we call the fertility transition, where women began to restrict their fertility. It begins in about the 1880s, gets underway in the 1990s, and then particularly between 1920 and 1940, between the wars, a great deal of that done without contraception. It's done by withdrawal, it's done by abstinence. So women wanted to reduce their families, and men wanted the families reduced as well. You can't do this without men's consent. And so it's one of an extraordinary social change that took place in the privacy of the bedroom, but without even much help from technology. So our story becomes, leave the figures alone, that's the picture I've given you to see that we've actually got quite a small group of people who survive to have children and produce descendants. So our history, we tend to focus on the winners and we tend to ignore the many losers. They don't leave much record, and they certainly don't have descendants to go and look for them. We think around 20% of the men who were transported to Tasmania got married. Now, that's partly a shortage of women, but it was also that they themselves were a bit too screwed up to be able to settle down. Overall, it's estimated that around 10% of male convicts did well, and predominantly you did well if you came early. It always pays, if you're going to be a coloniser, to be in the first generation, because that's where the land was. So people who were able to be early get land, and so many of the big famous families, particularly in New South Wales, like the one that Kevin Rudd is descended from, they got land very early. They're able to stabilise. They start having big families, and before you know where you are, you've got a tribe. What we found was that men convicts lived longer for every child that we found. So in a couple of more months each one. So the man who has one child doesn't live nearly as long as the one who has 12. That didn't happen for women until they had grandchildren. And that's telling us a lot about most of the women actually at some stage bore a child, but that child died, or they only bore one, or they bore one while they were in the convict system, which was a crime in itself, but they don't produce a family. And to be able to produce children who not only live, but then grow up to be stable enough to have their own children, that suggests something about what sort of life the female convict has had. Now, this is not making judgments about people as whether they're fit or unfit or superior or not. This is actually more about the society. Can you find a way to make a living? Can you provide a roof over the head of a family? Is there work that can keep you going while a family is growing? It's a test of the society as much as it is of the individual. So don't think that I'm saying anything about these people being better breeders or better colonists. It's about the fit between the individual in time and place and whether they can find a way to be able to get on. And of course, as in life, luck plays a big part. They might just meet someone who helps them. They might just have a lucky break. As you'll see, some of them who came to Victoria had the immensely lucky break of finding gold. So the convict ancestor history is the history of a remarkable minority who succeeded in founding a lineage. They're the special ones, they're the outliers, they're the remarkable ones. Most Vandemonians were not recidivists, they weren't going back to serious crime, and most of their later offences were driven by alcohol and destitution. But the big break they had was that those who came to Victoria were the first to find the gold. They were in the place when it was happening, they knew how to dig, they knew how to work the land, they knew how to live in the bush, they knew how to find their way around the bush, and so they were far better placed than even people who'd been as settlers a while to be able to pick up the alluvial gold, and they did. And the reports were coming back to Tasmania of the shocking thing to many people that all these ex-convicts were suddenly filling their pockets with large quantities of gold. This was both shocking and very, very exciting. And we think around 30,000 people that have been traced to go to Victoria, but I would think it's actually significantly more. Quite a few of them went back to Tasmania, or they went on to New South Wales, or they went on to South Australia. But I would say that at least half of the convicts sent to Tasmania eventually either went to Victoria or passed through Victoria. So the Victorian part of the convict story is a big one. But after the gradual settling of the gold rush, after the gold rushes, which morphed into a more stable, deep lead mining, which needed a working class, which became unionised, which became wage labour, and within Melbourne in particular, but also big cities, rural cities regional cities like Ballarat and Bendigo. If you've been there, you can see the extraordinary buildings that were built. And so the economy then very much is driven by building the new society, building these cities, building these grand houses and big public buildings, and working in service industries. Now, a few got land in the Selection Acts, but it was more likely that their children would get farms, and it depended where they got it. I mean, a lot of the land that was released by the Selection Acts, as happened to Red Kelly, Ned Kelly's father, was terrible land, and they couldn't make a living from it. But others, their children might get land and make them work. But others, they get land because they've got the money to buy it. And the number of our ex-convicts were that. But others sort of maybe they'd have kept offending a bit. There's one family in Kyneton who had been back in Wiltshire, convicts butchers who stole the animals they sold. So that was very common for people to be trading in livestock and selling it as butchered meat. And when they came to, were transported and then later came to Victoria and settled in Kyneton, they started doing the same thing. And then they got caught. And so their children and some of them retreated into the bush, and they've become bush dwellers as splitters, splitting trees for the props for the mines. They become hawkers, they become bushwalkers, and they're living in the forest areas. They're very poor, and they tended to marry into other ex-convict families. Now, I imagine there are significant parts of New South Wales where ex-convicts retreated into the bush and stayed there for generations. I would think probably parts around the Hawkesbury, but parts of the Blue Mountains, Lithgow, and they later become perhaps people who go into becoming miners and so on. But those who survived and made a life in respectable society, they had to live a life of secrets and lies. And so this is the other side of the story. There was a penalty you paid that you couldn't reveal your origins. And they've got to live for the rest of their lives always covering up, trying to conceal this missing 7 or 8 years. Many of them lied about their ages to their spouses. Many of them never told their wives and husbands that they'd been a convict. Or if they did, it was never told to the children. And so people are still finding out, even though they've known the family history, that in fact they had been, great-grandpa had been a convict. Now, the convicts who came early were coming with the first squatters in Victoria. They came as their assigned servants, or they came as free men who had been pardoned and were their servants. And they become the front line of colonising Europe. So they, particularly they're out in the bush as shepherds, living in primitive huts, completely isolated and alone. They've got a gun. They're not allowed to drink, but whether they did get drinks is another matter. They start imagining all sorts of things, and they are in the front line of the war against Aboriginal people. So in particularly, the two big areas of massacres in Victoria are in the Western District, which is one of the areas settled first, and the other is in Gippsland, which was settled a bit later. But we know that there were incursions of Europeans before the 1830s. We know because of all the evidence of venereal disease that was witnessed on Aboriginal women, and the people getting into Victoria before 1835 are whalers and sealers, men who are men without a country, men who are completely outside civilization, so very dangerous individuals, and also escaped convicts. So we know that people were getting into Aboriginal communities because by the time the Europeans began to settle, they found Aboriginal the population had already collapsed to around 15,000 by the time they came here, from 60,000, and that was a combination mostly of smallpox and then venereal disease. So here they are, they're the infantry of the colonial invasion. The officers are the men on horses, they're the squatters themselves, who are often gentry. We now are beginning to find out much more about how much of the capital that was utilised to settle Western Victoria, as in Tasmania, was in fact the proceeds of slavery, and were the reparations paid to people for the loss of their slaves after the abolition of slavery. So there's a lot of money, and the young men who were sent by these companies, like the Clyde Company, have as they're the officers, and they've got, these are their infantry, their troops, and the convicts. There's hardly any women, so that Aboriginal women are very vulnerable. And here we see S.T. Gill's painting of the Reavengers. The Aboriginal people have probably killed some animals, so they're out to kill them. Now, there are early success stories, and here's some of the faces of them. These are the ones who came early, were lucky, and if you didn't if you didn't buy urban land, you bought urban land, and a number of these men were able to do that. But this is the one I want to talk about. He's a lovely man who was a swing rioter. Now, the swing riots of 1830-31 were most across southern England in agricultural areas, which by then were now very poor. It was, the money was in the north with the industrialising industries of coal and cotton. But the rural England was very poor, and a huge number of the free immigrants and assisted immigrants to Victoria in particular come from quite specific areas, particularly East Anglia, which was very depressed, but also from places like Wiltshire. And what was happening to agricultural labourers, not only had they lost their entitlements with the enclosure of the lands, but you also have them facing the fact that they're starting to use machinery. And this gentleman was living in Wiltshire with his sister. They'd lost their parents. The women's work in particular was drying up. Their local big farmer was introducing a threshing machine. So he was so enraged, he joined a group who went and burnt and damaged the threshing machine. The revenge on the this uprising was savage by the law, and a couple of hundred were sentenced to death. There was complete outrage in the rest of the community, and those were commuted to transportation. And he is one of those that was transported. But he was an extremely gifted horticulturalist, and he got taken up by Mr. Kerr for the North Vandemonians Land Company, and he was so good at growing vegetables that Mr. Kerr wouldn't get him his ticket of leave, even though he was entitled to it. And he was winning prizes. He grew enormous pumpkins and cucumbers. He's one of those champion English cucumber growers. And he but finally he got out of the convict system, came to Victoria, went to the suburb of Richmond, bought some land, a couple of blocks, and started growing vegetables. Now, when the gold rush was first announced, he was off at once to the goldfields, came back quite quickly with around £1,500, which was an awful lot of money, and went and bought about 15 acres in Preston, not far from the Pentridge prison. And it was there he established a huge market garden and a provisioning business providing hardware and supplies for agriculture and horticulture. And he had also had an orchard, and he was actually one of the major feeders of Melbourne. He then retired. He'd bought further land, urban property, retired back to Richmond, lived in his own little street where he'd had some further developments in his house called Mulberry Cottage. And there he is in his garden at Mulberry Cottage in his old age. Now, he died in his 80s, leaving a family, and he was knocked over by a tram. And when his will has detailed the amount of property he had and all it was left to, and he was still illiterate. And he'd made a fortune as an illiterate man. Now, the others, this man was not illiterate. This man was became a sort of self-created school teacher. He's found himself interacting with Aboriginal people in central Victoria in the Loddon, came to the city, kept himself by starting schools, and then he established a post office in Moonee Ponds, and continued his work with Aboriginal people and wrote a book about them in later life. So you've got those sorts of extremes amongst these sort of men, but they all came earlier, and they all were very canny about the way they used their money. This is a rather sad story. I don't know if any of you can remember, have been, you're sure you've all been to Melbourne, but the Royal Exhibition building is over here. And this big terrace of blue stone houses in Nicholson Street is still there, as are these other houses, and is the convent school down here. It's called Royal Terrace. It was built in 1854 by John Moon Bryant, who had actually been transported on the Mangles in 1835. Bryant had quickly established himself as a good businessman after he was released in Hobart, came to Melbourne, did more business, ran building supplies and was doing building, and finally got it together to build this magnificent terrace. And his plan was to live in this one with his 10 children and to live off the rents of the rest of this, as well as his other investments, which he did. And then he set about being, as a gentleman of means, to have an appropriate gentleman's life, which means civic duty. So he got onto the Fitzroy Council. This is in the suburb of Fitzroy, and wanted to be mayor. And then people started whispers about him, so that ended. And then he got on the board of the Melbourne Benevolent Asylum. And he unwisely just questioned the integrity of a collector. And then all hell broke loose, and they went for him to expose him as having been a convict. He denied it. He ended up in court. He produced witnesses from England. He produced witnesses from Tasmania, and he included a witness who'd known him in Tasmania. That was Dr. Cook, who lived in that time in this house. Dr. Cook said he'd known him to be always a free man, which wasn't true, but Miss Dr. Cook was wanting to help him. And it was to Dr. Cook that he went in the end with tears in his eyes and stripped so that Dr. could inspect his back and establish that he bore no marks of flagellation. So he had to humiliate himself, and that was all reported in the press. But that was the end of his time on the Melbourne Benevolent Asylum, so he withdrew into life in Fitzroy and into the Methodist Church. And when he died, he left a lot of money to charity and to the Methodist Church, and his children, of course, except that most of it disappeared in the big bank crash a few years later. By the way, in 1856, my grandfather was renting a room in this building, and his future wife was living with her mother down here. So I think they met in the street. So John Bryant May was one of the outstanding convicts, but the fact that he was a Methodist is important, because increasingly I was finding that the ones who were successful had joined the Methodist Church. Methodism remains very big in Tasmania. It was in Victoria the church of the frontier, because all you needed was a hymn book and something to start a tune with. Even a tuning fork would do. And everything was there in the hymn book, all the theology. And Methodists were very flexible in the way they worshipped, and they drew in other people. So Robert Menzies, growing up in Jeparit in the Wimmera, his family obviously was Scottish and Presbyterian, but the only local church was Methodist, so they all became Methodists. And although he reverted to Presbyterianism in later life, his brother, Frank, who was a barrister, remained an active Methodist for all his life. Why did they go to Methodism? Well, Methodists, first of all, had been opposed to slavery from the beginning, so maybe that made them more open. But the theology was that if you received the Holy Spirit, if you had a conversion experience, if you were in a state of grace, everything nasty in you had been taken out and replaced by goodness. So the hymns talk about that you're being filled with this new spirit. If you wanted to get rid of the bad old you, Methodism was the place to go, because it was promising that you could be different, you could change. And the church itself was welcoming. Anyone could become a lay preacher, anyone could run a Sunday school class. It trained people in running meetings, in writing letters, in doing minutes, in public speaking, even in preaching. And so it gave ordinary people an opportunity for leadership and prominence and self-expression, which they wouldn't get as an Anglican or as a Presbyterian, where everything had to be run by the elders and the minister, or the Catholic Church, where the priest ran everything. So that's why Methodism flourished. And it's also the reason Methodism was such an important cradle for the trade union and labour movement. Now, just another couple of stories. Daniel Backway, who's this chap here, was a London orphan whose father had been a Thames lighterman. That is, he had been a member of an honourable guild, and he had, after a long apprenticeship, was looking after the boats that unloaded ships in the Thames. Very skilled work. But his mother had already died. It would probably tuberculosis, looking at when it happened and leaving all these children without a mother. And then in 1831, his father suddenly died. And what happened in 1831, it was the cholera had come to London. And as a man working on the river, he would have been exposed immediately to it. So Daniel and his siblings are left as orphans and was sent to the Limehouse workhouse, which is where orphans were sent. He was soon apprenticed out to a chimney sweep, as a climbing boy. And so they cleaned the chimneys by sending very small boys to climb these terribly, come on, think of Mary Poppins, these tall brick chimneys going in and out. They'd get stuck, they'd become suffocated, they were fighting off the coal dust and coming on into their eyes and mouths and noses all the way, and they'd get stuck and they'd have to light fires or they'd freeze with fear. Anyway, he lasted a couple of months, and after a couple of months, Daniel's in court again, or he's in court, but this time covered in cuts and bruises, and he's in ragged clothes and he's shivering with cold and crying. And his climbing master, the chimney sweep, and his mistress were accused of cruelty. And they'd been obviously shackled around his ankles. They'd been pushing their sharp fingernails into his chest, and they were prosecuted. Now, he went back to another climbing chimney sweep. By 16, he's in a gang of boys stealing clothes. So he got transported, but he was literate. He'd learnt to read and write somewhere, either before he went to his father died, or he'd done so in the workhouse, though he wasn't in it for long. But they made every attempt to teach convicts to read and write. So there were classes on board the convict ships, so that they could improve their literacy there. And if they came as child convicts, they were also given classes. Now, he got married, came to Victoria, went immediately to the goldfields, even though he's a city man, a man of the city. He started mining gold in Frierstown, and then advertised in the paper for his wife's relatives to come and join them. And they ended up in Maryborough. And it was there that he was able to take advantage of the really big achievement of the gold rush and Eureka, which is not the gold so much as the right to vote and the miner's right. And there were two types of miner's right. There was one that gave you the right to mine in a certain piece of land, and there was a second right that gave you the right to build a house. It was known as a town right. And for a guinea a year, you could build a house. It was a 1/4 acre block. Sounds familiar. You could have a horse, you could have a cart, you could have chooks, you could have cows, you could have vegetable garden, you could have orchard trees, and you could stay on that all your life. And if you were a miner and you ran away or you died, your wife, deserted wife or widow, inherited it, so she didn't lose her home, and then you could leave it to your children. And so his family and their descendants stayed on this miner's right in Maryborough for more than a century. And there were still people living in miners' rights in Ballarat in the 1990s. Now, this was a piece of public housing. This is social housing provided by the state. This was the Crown land, and which you were able to, for a very small bit of money, purchase an entitlement to live. And it's what saved those goldfields towns, so that they were able to transition into becoming rural regional industry. Maryborough not only continued to have mining, but it even ended up having paper mills and big textile factories and printing. Ballarat and Bendigo all became major engineering areas. Castlemaine is a big engineering area, and they all got wool and textile and wool weaving. So they had a working class that had somewhere safe to live. And this made all the difference to the sort of society that people were able to have in those regional towns. And today, and it's there that really we see modern trade unionism emerge from amongst the miners. Yes, we've got a trades hall in Melbourne from 1858, given on land by a Catholic premier when it was still against the law to picket or be at a union in the United Kingdom. The trades unions got their own hall in 1858. And we've had already by then, by 1856, the big strike to get the 8-hour day. But the sort of modern unionism, the large unionism, begins in these rural towns where you've got a working class that's been supported by this sort of housing. Now, this is a notable moral failure. This is Ellen Miles, whose story runs through the whole book. She was known as the Buzzwinker, which is cant for being a thief. She had the longest record of any woman in the 19th century in the Victorian prison records. And when she was transported at 11, she already had 31 previous convictions in Bloomsbury in London. She was passing counterfeit coin, all organised by her father, who was trying to get her and her sisters all transported so he didn't have to support them. So she was one of the few survivors because she never became an alcoholic. And so she was able to live for years and years, actually kept alive by the amount of time she spent in prison, where she was cleaned up, got medical care, got clean clothes and got food. But she didn't miss the alcohol, so that's why she survived so long. And she lived a life that was entirely public, that she hardly ever had any sort of private home or private life, and she was kept by the state really all her life. And there she is. Mary Keegan, on the other hand, was from Ireland after the famine came in 1849 on the Australasia. She was a drinker, but you can see here that at age 74, that she's still, you can see the bones, that she's been a beautiful woman, but she's absolutely bleary-eyed with alcohol by now. Her behaviour was so dreadful, her daughter refused to have anything to do with her. And so that was her sad end. And that was very common amongst convict women. Here we've got one of the great stories of the gold rush, which is known as the Digger's Wedding. If you've been to Sovereign Hill, they usually reenact this every day. But this came from a trope, a story that everyone was talking about. Wasn't it shocking to see these vulgar people suddenly covered in gold, lighting their cigars with £5 notes, and with them were these awful young women from the unions, which means they came from workhouses, they were Irish, who had, God help us, thick ankles. This was the ultimate insult for a woman, was to say that she had thick ankles. And they drove around town, and Dickens picked this up, and it was a story that was in Household Words. It starts in Romeo Lane, which is the epicentre of the red light district that was run by the Vandemonian women. It's today at the corner of what's now Crossley Street, which is where Pellegrini's coffee shop is. But the whole story is of this horror and the topsy-turvy that poor people, vulgar people, ignorant people should suddenly have money. It just wasn't right. So this is S.T. Gill's view of what Melbourne was like in its rough past, because these miners, these poor men, and particularly if they'd been convicts, were suddenly found themselves with huge quantities of gold. They just went mad. And they'd turn up into the city with pocketfuls and bags full of gold secreted in their clothing, and delirious with joy. And they'd go off to Romeo Lane to have a good time, which meant drinking a lot, and they'd lose the lot. So Ellen Miles once boasted that she'd spent thousands and thousands of pounds in the colony, and she had all of it stolen off drunken miners. But to give you a sense of how wild life was, this is in Ballarat there were 100 hotels, and this was the recipe for 1,000 hotels. What am I talking about? This is the recipe for the favourite drink. It was half a pint of methylated spirits, half a cupful of cayenne pepper, half a teaspoon of Indian opium, 2 gallons of water, 2 gallons of Jamaica rum, use hot water, stir well, allow to stand for 24 hours. That was the knocker, well named, and it was the favourite drink in Ballarat. So the children of the gold rush generation actually didn't do that well. And that applied also to those who came free. Their children become the larrikins and the gangs, which if it was bad in Sydney, it was even worse in Melbourne by the 1870s and 80s. With the gold rush, there was a colossal baby boom. And there's a surge of young people in the cities all over the streets. In the country, they could run around in the bush where terrible things happened to them, but like they got lost or they fell down holes or whatever. But what you've got in the cities is these very tiny houses and big families of 8 to 12 kids. There's nowhere in the house for them, even hardly to sleep. So they're on the street, they're outside. It's a childhood which is entirely outside, running around the streets. The second generation were also poorly educated. The schools were very limited, and many of their parents were very mobile, moving if in the gold districts from place to place to try their luck, or in the city, they're running out of money, so they're having to do a midnight flit. They're moving school if they're going to school at all. And there was also a shortage of opportunities for getting an apprenticeship. So few had proper trades, and many had gone to work far too young. It was easy for a young person to get a job and get some money, but then they got stuck. So as they aged, they became increasingly unemployable as they had no special skills. And by the 1890s depression, as older people, they're on the scrap heap. In the city, the Vandemonian families were largely invisible, but what's striking is how poor they were, that they'd started with nothing and they ended with nothing. They were not able to do well except for a minority. So this is what's happening in crime in New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania in that time. You can see in Tasmania a huge peak in crime just after the gold rush and at the end of the convict period, and then it crashes, and then Tasmania became a very law-abiding place, one of the most law-abiding in the world. Victoria, huge crime burst in the gold rush in the 1860s, settles. These are years with no figures. And then it rises again in the 1880s and 90s. Here's the 1890s depression, and it's going. Now, New South Wales is a lot more stable. If this is the larrikins here, but the larrikin problem is much bigger in Victoria because Victoria at this time had a bigger population. Melbourne was a bigger city than Sydney. So, but what's bringing out change? There's a dying out of the founding generation of convicts, and that starts to reduce the number of very bad drunks, reduce the number of people in mental illness on the streets, the fewer beggars. People are getting more respectable, and they're forming families. And as I said, Methodism, particularly in the country, was very powerful. This is a group meeting on the goldfields, and for all the disorder of the goldfields, there was an awful lot of religion of this kind. But how do we understand the steeper story? And we can use a concept like structural violence, which is about powerlessness. It worked against women and children who had no means or family, and especially against Aboriginal women. It worked against the poor, the uneducated, the orphaned and disconnected. These are all people who've got no means of defence against exploitation or violence. Against offenders because they're outside the moral magic circle, against anyone unable to compete in what was a very harsh and cruel world. Many of them, a very large number really, were damaged goods from childhoods of parental loss, abuse and neglect. And we tend to sort of think of people in the past as sort of being like us, but they weren't. Charles Dickens was not exaggerating. People did grow up in a world of great cruelty and violence. It was a very cruel time, and the world had been very cruel always before that. And so you've got a lot of people who are quite damaged by that. But what begins to change is the gradual institutional protection, first of all, as children, as people with rights in their own right. And so that we see with that the emergence of children's literature, the restriction of the employment of children in factories and mines, and the extension of schooling, and the idea that children have to be protected, that you can't rely on their parents alone to do that. So we've got in Victoria this year, we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Education Act, which brought in a new era. It was secular, compulsory and free. It's just that it took the working class a long time to start accepting the compulsory bit. So even by the 1890s, there was a lot of absenteeism and it's not going to school. But the Education Act is a beginning of the children being brought into an institution that's keeping an eye on them, has got their back. By the early 20th century, driven by a group of pioneering women doctors principally, but also by various community and religious groups, you've got the emergence of various types of special institutions for children, council creches, which still exist in the inner city for working mothers, the establishment of the free kindergarten union, free kindergartens for working class children, the gradual slow humanisation of the school, where lessons became more interesting, there was less corporal punishment, and the reduction in cruel corporal punishment, which really didn't finish until probably the 1970s. Most important of all, however, is what's happening to their parents, is that from the Second World War, with first the war economy and then post-war reconstruction, we get first the big increase in secure work. That's work secured by government, first of all for war industry, and secondly by the support of government for private enterprise in post-war reconstruction. And we've got the welfare state, payments to widows, sick and unemployed. And that's still an unfinished project. But finally, these are a generation, two generations after the convicts. These are children in South Melbourne in 1932. For Melbourne, the worst year of the Depression, and in a very, very poor suburb. And they're not looking too bad. One of the intriguing things about the Depression is that the statistics for child health do not show a dramatic fall in children's health, that by then there's just enough institutional support from kindergarten, schools, health centres to be looking out for children and keeping them fed and clothed. So a lot of these children would have been being fed at school by their teacher. So we know that often the teachers were getting into their own resources to provide meals, but there's someone looking out for them and it's making a difference. So they're looking a lot better than they would have looked in the 1890s. And that's the end of our story. Thank you.